Усім вітання, це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Я Ангеліна Карякіна, разом зі мною моя напарниця, співавторка
Наталка Гуменюк. Вітання.
Привіт, Наталко! Продовжуємо наші розмови з цікавими медійниками та медійницями. Ти записала розмову з Джоді Гінзберг, це директорка комітету захисту журналістів або CPJ. Медійна організація, дуже поважна в світі, яка захищає права журналістів. Розкажи, будь ласка, на чому ти цього разу вирішила сфокусуватися і де ти Джоді вловила? Чи ви говорили з нею онлайн?
Ми говорили з Джоді онлайн, але ми цього року не раз зустрічалися, будучи там в певних спільнотах, зокрема, які там говорять про ризики для жінок-журналістів у світі. Головний контекст в тому, що останні роки постійно б'ють рекорди, світові рекорди по кількості і ув'язнених журналістів, і журналістів, яких вбивають по всьому світі, і ми маємо тенденцію, в яких робота журналіста умови стають гіршими у всьому світі. І, власне, в цьому контексті я й ставила запитання, а який сенс, скажімо так, що можуть зробити такі організації, як навіть, це, здається, одна з найповажніших організацій, Комітет захисту журналістів, чи вони на щось спроможні? Очевидно, що ми починали з ситуації з українськими журналістами, зокрема в російських в'язницях, і випадком загибелі Вікторії Рощиної, нашої колеги, бо, власне, з цього я й починала, так? Що історія Вікторії особливо трагічна, що вона була достатньо відомою, і така організація, Комітет захисту журналістів, робила те, що вона може, так? Не мовчала, там намагалася щось писати, але не змогла. І моє було питання, а що ви взагалі можете, да? І як ви в таких обставинах працюєте? Тому ми говорили про Україну, ми багато говорили про вбивства таргетовані журналістів, не просто журналістів в Газі, а державу Ізраїль, що йдеться зараз про 249 журналістів, які було вбито армією Ізраїля. Такі цифри Комітету захисту журналістів. І йдеться про журналістів не лише в Газі, але в тому самому випадку в Ємені. Я, зокрема, підняла це питання, тому що воно навіть мене якось зачепило, що цього року було вбито в одномоментній атаці 10 вересня 31 журналіст, це було в столиці Ємену Сана. І це подія, там, один з наймасштабніших випадків одномоментного вбивства журналістів, про який, насправді, навіть не став дуже великою новиною для світу. Да? І ми говорили про цю нормалізацію, але також про те, в чому є особливість роботи, не роботи журналістів в Газі, а висвітлення цієї ситуації, коли журналістів звинувачують в тому, що вони, можливо, співпрацюють, я не знаю, з Хамас. І Джоді розповідала про свої умови, вона представник американської організації, проте, насправді, наскільки їхні організації не просто говорити про Газу, з яким вони, скажімо, тиском і спротивом донорів інколи стикаються, так, і в чому особливість саме ця, наскільки ця війна конкретно руйнує довіру до західних ЗМІ, зокрема. Ми говорили, і я в цьому випадку навіть перейшла трошки до іншої теми, коли є питання, в якому випадку вони тоді захищають журналістів, і коли вони можуть говорити, що там хто є пропагандистом, так, а хто є представником державного медіа авторитарної країни, але все ж таки журналістом, так, і як оце змістилося поняття, які їхні критерії захисту. Ми загалом говорили також, і конкретно там в цьому випадку про таргетовані атаки на журналістів з Гази, як на Анаса Аль-Шаріфа, якого було вбито. Обов'язково перейшли до розмови про Сполучені Штати, так, і той тиск, який чиниться на нівелювання роботи чинної адміністрації Трампа, що це змінює, як поводяться американські журналісти, про роль і штучного інтелекту, і технології в умовно в цькуванні, маргіналізації журналістів, і особливості роботи жінок-журналістів, і цькування онлайн, яке також є надзвичайно характерним для сучасного світу. Про те, як змінюється, зокрема, інструментарій авторитарних режимів по відношенню до журналістів, як закони застосовуються проти них. Але, знаєш, Джоді до цього працювала редактором Reuters, відомої світової агенції. в великих західних медіа. І я її навіть попросила сказати, щоб вона пояснила, а чим важливі журналісти і навіщо вони мають мати особливий захист. Тому що ми вже виросли в поколінні, коли журналісти цього особливого захисту не мають. Ну і наостанок, звісно, говорили про те, що ж все-таки дає надію, тому що все-таки дуже багато сучасних інструментів дають нам змогу працювати простіше, ніж багато-багато років назад, незважаючи на всі ті речі, які ми перерахували.
Ну що ж, давайте тоді слухати розмову Наталки з головою Комітету захисту журналістів Джоді Гінзберг.
Ми дуже дякуємо нашим слухачам, вам за ту підтримку, яку ви здійснюєте для цього подкасту, зокрема для роботи наших чудових колег, звукорежисерки Люби Гук і редакторки Іри Лопатіної. І на прохання ваше ми це зробили. Ми створили на сторінці лабораторії журналістики суспільного інтересу не просто сторіночку, де ви можете донатити за реквізитами, але й можливість робити одноразовий донат і регулярний донат. Довелося нам попрацювати над цим, але тепер це можливо. Знаю, що ці донати приходять. Це дуже-дуже нас підтримує. Знаємо, що в Україні багатьох потрібно підтримувати, але якщо є така змога, щоб ці розмови далі виходили, ми вам неймовірно вдячні. Це дуже надихає. Jodie, thank you for joining. I'm really keen to talk to you because we see something that the position of journalists, it's not any longer the protected position in the society. Actually, we are more target, whether it would be the war or any other situation. So it's not like we have lost our protection. The journalists are targeted globally by different groups and the governments in different societies, including in democracies. But my first question, of course, would be about Ukraine, because we still have around 30 journalists in the Russian detention. And I do understand that organizations like CPJ can do little to protect journalists in the front line. You know, when the journalists are dying because of the bombs in the front line, it's horrible. But, you know, we understand the situation, you know, like it's a very physical threat. But when the journalists are in detention, you still think like whether there is any leverage to bring them back, and why, of course, it's such a sad and tragic thing for me personally to talk to you, of course, because of our colleague Victoria Roshina, you know, like who was quite known compared to most of the journalists which now are behind the bars, whose issue was raised on all the levels, all the international organizations like CPJ, and while she was still alive. And she was dead in the end. She didn't survive the imprisonment. We don't have the final conclusion what happened to her, but there are enough reasons to believe that beyond critical conditions, she was physically, she might have been beaten. There might be, you know, like they were not really planning to return her. Then we waited for her body back for quite some time. Still, I think like the effort was done. In her case, this particular thing make you very powerless. What do you think such organization like yours or other organization to support journalists can still do to at least keep alive those who are still alive?
Examples like that of Victoria are heartbreaking for the very reasons that you mentioned, which is we operate on the basis that where we can't actually get someone out of prison because we're dealing with a regime that does not respond to pressure from organizations like CPJ. And there are more and more of those, unfortunately, globally. At least by raising the case, we let a regime know that we're observing. And our hope is always that if it can't free them, keeps them safe to some extent. And that's why Victoria's death, I think, was so shocking, was because I think there was a feeling that having had the international community talk about that case, that there was some degree of protection. We are actually using that experience to really think about what we are doing now in this moment, right? Because traditionally, CPJ has documented the numbers of people in jail. And what we used to do was, while we kept a watching brief on it, we would formally document the number of people in jail on December 1st every year, and that would be our sort of official prison census. But of course, that meant that come December the 2nd, already the information is out of date because other people might have been arrested, other people might have been jailed. So we've moved to a situation in which we're monitoring that much more dynamically. But what we're also starting to do is really think about what are the points of danger for people when they go into prison. Because there are points where we know that people are more vulnerable. For example, when they get moved from one prison to another prison, and suddenly you don't know where they are, you don't know how they're being treated. How can we keep a closer observation? How can we alert people that we know that that move is happening, for example? I think those are questions that we can really start to think about how we are talking about conditions in prison, for example. It's not enough to say a record number of journalists are in jail. The experience of people in jail is also important. How are they being treated? In some countries, journalists and other individuals who are considered political type prisoners are often moved really far away from their home territory so that they cannot be supported by families. And that's part of a deliberate strategy. So how do we make sure that they're supported? How can we bring in more people to show that they're being observed? You, I think, have just come back from the Philippines. One of the cases we've worked on a lot there is the case of Frenchime Kumpio, for example, who's currently in jail in the Philippines. We have worked really hard to raise that case in a way that international observers feel that they can become more involved. In other words, that representatives from embassies go to her trial. Representatives from embassies have visited her in prison. And that ups the political stakes, right? Because it's very easy for many regimes like Russia to ignore something like CPJ. You know, we're a US headquartered organization. We're not physically based in Russia. It's more difficult if you up political pressure. So if you have observers from international embassies who are able to go and monitor trials, for example, or at least let authorities know if they're aware of the case. So I think those are ways that we can step up the pressure on governments even when we can't actually get people freed.
So more about this unfortunate, let's say, normalization of the murder of the journalist by state. You know, while preparing, I again looked for CPJ webpage, and you know what, I was taken aback. I consider myself pretty curious person who follows some of the foreign news. I follow the war in Gaza. I sign most of the letters in support of the international journalists and reporters. So I pay kind of attention. And somehow I'm looking like, okay, Yemen, where I was on September 10th, that, I kind of missed one of the deadliest attack recently where 31 journalists was killed in a strike by Israel in capital of Yemen on Sana'a. And I just was disappointed by myself. Yes, I started to remember what happened to me that I missed that news. But there is something in case it's like one of the deadliest attack of the last decades. One single attack when 31 journalists was killed in one attack by the state. And somebody like me can miss it in the news.
But you know why that is, right? Because there has been a deliberate attempt in recent years by Israel, but also by others, to paint all journalists as terrorists or terrorist sympathizers and therefore unreliable. So in the case that you're describing in Yemen, the Israeli army argued that those individuals were part of the PR arm of the military and therefore their killings were justified. We have heard that again and again in the war in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, that essentially the argument is no one in Gaza can be trusted. They're all sympathizers if they're not actual terrorists, and therefore we should not believe anything they say. but worse, we're going to justify their killings. And so the reason that you didn't know about that case is partly also the reason why the response to the killings of journalists in Gaza has been pathetic, is because Israel has succeeded in pushing a narrative that says every single journalist in Gaza is in some way untrustworthy, and that has sown doubt in people's minds. So they start to think, well, maybe that's the case, and they're not really journalists, and it's not really important. That is something that was true in Israel prior to October the 7th. There were many cases where Israeli forces killed a journalist and then alleged with very little credible evidence that they were terrorists. And we have seen that pattern escalated during the genocide. In other words, journalists are killed. Israel alleges that they are terrorists. They produce evidence that is not considered credible, and then they move on. And in a number of cases, of course, since October the 7th, not only did they do it after the fact, but they did it before the fact. In other words, to try and justify what was the subsequent killing. And we saw that, for example, in the case of Anas al-Sharif, the Al Jazeera journalist who was killed in August. He had for more than a year been subject to these kinds of smears, these kinds of allegations that sort of changed in severity as the war went on and as his reporting went on. They became more and more severe until the point that we warned 2 weeks before his killing that we felt that he was being readied for murder. And of course, that proved to be the case. But not only was he killed, but several other Al Jazeera journalists were killed alongside him. And Israel didn't even make an attempt to justify their killings. You know, it creates an environment in which you don't even have to, at a certain point, make an excuse to kill journalists because that's considered sort of acceptable.
We know that according to your information, there's a CPJ, 249 journalists are killed in Palestine, 166 are wounded, 94 are behind the bars. But I really want to return to the case of Anas al-Sharif. And I also say I was pretty, devastated by this particular case, because when I learned about his murder, I was like, it was just a few days after the funeral of Victoria. I was thinking how, she killed. And then I saw quite a few Ukrainian media organizations more or less copied the IDF press release that the Hamas-related journalist was killed. And I'm like, but the first thing you Google about Anas is really CPJ warning that there is a huge defamation campaign against him. And there is UN rapporteur who is like calling to protect Anas because he's under threat. So it's so easy, like just with one Google, understand that he is not. There is a warning. There was a big kind of red flag saying like, stop, he's denounced, he will be accused. And still he was killed. So do you still see a bit situation moving that the mainstream media at least trying to understand better what's happening to the journalism, or you still see that you as a CPJ are kind of fighting on your own against kind of this narrative which is already set regarding the journalists in Gaza?
So I think things have changed since October the 7th, but not a great deal. In other words, I think we've moved from a position where people were almost quoting Israel verbatim as truth to a point where people are finally doing their work as journalists, which is to ask the difficult questions and do the reporting and try and establish for themselves what might be happening. And it's interesting to me, right, particularly as you talk about Ukrainian journalists, we don't accept the words of the Russian authorities, right, as the truth, as the final version, right? Because we know that all governments, the British government, the American government, the Russian government, is on some level engaged in propaganda. Sometimes it's just to make themselves look a bit better. Sometimes it's outright lies. But as journalists, our job is to be skeptical and to do the triangulation. But on Israel, what we saw again and again is the willingness of people to prioritize the Israeli version of events over everything else, and to sort of rehearse it without question, to run what Israel and Israeli spokespeople said, as the headline, as opposed to a piece of information that makes up the whole. So I think things have improved, but I still think we are really struggling against this very powerful narrative that has deliberately sought to undermine the validity of what Gazan journalists had been reporting. And it just on the numbers, I think currently, what according to our reporting, I believe it's 206 Palestinians who've been killed in Gaza by Israel. Then, of course, you've got the Yemenis, some Lebanese journalists in Lebanon, and 3 Iranians. But I do think that remains an uphill struggle. And I do think that the way that this has been covered is going to have ramifications for our industry for decades to come.
In what way? The trust to journalists, the trust to mainstream media because of how we cover Gaza?
I think the trust in journalism as a profession where people were felt to be taking sides as opposed to doing the job of reporting facts. I think the idea that there was a difference, that somehow Western reporting was in some way superior or ethically and morally more robust. I mean, I talk to friends in the region, in the Middle East, who say, we used to look up to some of these big news outlets. We used to invite their editors to come and do trainings and to speak to us about how to report ethically, how to do journalism. And we will never invite them again. We will never have them speak to us again because they failed to do the basic work of journalism in reporting on what was happening in Gaza. I don't think we can underestimate or overstate the impact that I think it's likely to have, particularly on journalists in the region, but generally on people's trust in Western media and its ability to report accurately.
I do understand that you're not in a position to tell much, but I'm curious whether for CPJ and the other US-based organization, it's easy to have the position you have, to call genocide a genocide. Because, there are donors, there was a level, not like of the self-censorship, but kind of a pressure maybe to remove funding. Or I do remember that especially after the October 7th and the first couple of years, there was for some organization the choice, how do they cover?
I want to be clear particularly about words like genocide, right? Because this is one of those things that ends up being a kind of very intense sort of discussion about how you decide and when you decide. Our job as an organization is not to determine if something is a genocide. There are bodies and human rights groups who do that work, whose research is that work. So we base the way in which we talk about things on that kind of research. However, what I would say is there was immense pressure, particularly I think in the US, perhaps not offer the version, I don't want to say version, that's the wrong word, because we just did our job. But I did get queries from people who would say things like, why are you spending so much time talking about Gaza? Are they really journalists? Questions that I never got about Ukraine, for example. Why every week is CPJ issuing statements about Gaza as if we were somehow stepping outside our mandate, as if we were stepping outside of our work. And I do know that other organizations felt tentative about speaking about what was happening because they were, for a variety of reasons. We spoke out about it not because we had a particular political view or an axe to grind, but because that's our job. Our job is to document threats to journalists and report them. And what we couldn't understand was why, in many cases, people were not doing the same thing, right? Why were people not doing the same thing? Because for us, we didn't feel like we were doing anything differently. We were just doing the thing that we did in Ukraine, that we did in Afghanistan, that we do everywhere, which is we document attacks on journalists. And what we documented was the deadliest period for journalists that we had ever documented. And those killings were committed by Israel. Now, you can argue about how we do our documentation. You can argue about how we define journalists, but that what you can't argue is inconsistency. We took exactly the same approach everywhere.
As about definition of journalist, I had a very interesting conversation. It stays for me for a very long time with Alejandra Ibarra, a brilliant Mexican journalist who doing something like the archive of the democracy fighters. This is the archive of the journalists who were killed in Mexico. And I was fascinated by one of her findings, because what she does, she also tries to preserve the work of those journalists, especially those kind of the domains are lost. And she told that, a lot of people who were killed, they were local, hyper-local reporters. So it was not very abstract kind of cartels or mafia. Very often it was, a journalist who was writing in a small town against the local authorities, and maybe it was not even mafia, maybe it was kind of a local authorities and the crime gangs, not somebody this abstract and big. But also she admitted that sometimes those journalists, they were kind of bloggers, they maybe quality of journalists was not very perfect, they maybe were very emotional, and of course, like when the journalists are killed and something happened, people like look to how perfect their work was. And for me, it's as a question, because I started to think about some of the Ukrainian journalists at different times who lost their lives or like who were threatened. And sometimes it's maybe not a perfect journalist and maybe a very kind of emotional blogger style, very sometimes biased, but that's still, it's definitely not a reason to kill a person. But I just really want to understand, how is it this discussion that like the quality of their journalism is discussed. Now, I'm, of course, speaking not about the extreme case of murder, but, like even detention or any kind of campaign. Often it indeed happens against the people who's maybe not perfect according to the Reuters or BBC, charter, but still they do what they do.
It's the eternal question for us at CPJ. So we define a journalist as anyone who's engaged in fact-based news gathering and dissemination. So that doesn't exclude people who have an emotional viewpoint. It would exclude people who are continuously and deliberately lying 24/7. And in some cases, and you mentioned the examples of people being arrested, in some cases, people who have worked as journalists, we would not consider being on our list of detained journalists as journalists, because we don't think that the reason they were arrested was related to their journalism. Because in many places, and you talk about a perfect journalist, I think this is a really interesting idea. In many places, the line is very blurred because doing the act of journalism in some countries is an activist act in and of itself, because it's a country where independent journalism might be outlawed or might be severely curtailed. So actually doing journalism makes you an activist, or that your reporting is a way for you to surface and advocate on particular issues, right? Because that's the only way to do it in particular communities. So you think about environmental journalism. And so in many cases, the line is extremely porous and blurred. Ultimately, we're looking at whether somebody is primarily and on a regular basis doing the work of journalism. So if you turned up to a protest and took a photo, but actually in your day job, you were mainly a taxi driver, that doesn't suddenly make you a journalist. It doesn't mean that it's okay to arrest you for taking a photo. It doesn't mean that it's okay to harm you for exercising your right to free expression, but we might not consider you a journalist unless you were doing that on a regular, repeated basis.
You mentioned and actually, you answered partially about the question about those who continuously lie 24/7, because this kind of blurred, and what like Israel tries to do is to say like they were propagandists. And for instance, for us, we would know that RT is propaganda. RT today, we can speak about that. It's not a discussion. It's like a state function propaganda, which also share quite a lot of hate, like even like the call for murder. How you look at those kind of like state organization in the authoritarian countries, which are semi-journalistic, semi-not, because again, it's like we can return to that case with Houthi media, in Yemen. But then I'm just trying kind of not to get into this double standard thing, kind of try to also understand how you operate in this complicated environment, because there are state propagandistic media run by the authoritarian states.
So this again is one of those areas where it gets very complicated, and it should be complicated and difficult. What I would say is, in every case, we do our utmost to consider what the journalist will be doing. Because while, of course, it's the case that many state organizations are propagandistic, journalists who are within them are doing different jobs and different jobs of work, and sometimes very important jobs of work to provide fact-based information to their communities. And so we, when we're considering this, try and look at the journalists themselves and the journalistic output as opposed to the states and the organ that they work for. And a good example of this is the journalist that we awarded with our International Press Freedom Award, well, one of the journalists we awarded with our International Press Freedom Awards, which is a Chinese journalist called Dong Yu, who had worked for a state-owned news outlet, Guangming Daily, and he was arrested for having lunch with a Japanese diplomat in Beijing and accused of espionage. Now, if we had had a blanket policy that said we don't support any journalists, we don't deal with any journalists who work for state media or propagandistic media, we might have said we're not going to support him or raise his case. But instead, what we look at is the journalism that he's doing and the reason for which he's being targeted. And I think that's very important. I was at an event once where a very senior minister from a European country said, well, look at terrible news outlets, like all of the Murdoch news outlets, And the worry that I have when you smear all news outlets as a particular thing is you miss sometimes the individuals within that who are doing good work as journalists. That's why we try as much as we can to look at the output of the journalist as opposed to thinking about this from a organizational standpoint.
You recently wrote the column for The Guardian about the Donald Trump more or less dismissing as the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I'll remember that is a Saudi journalist. It's still an awful case. His body in the consulate was dismembered and disposed, which is cruel and like odd and horrible. And Donald Trump said, things happen. I just want to compare that. I remember very well how Vladimir Putin, in the early stage of his political career, when that submarine sank, he said, there was this famous clip when he was asked, what's happened to the submarine with the people who sink? And he said, it sank, that's it. So it's kind of reminded me exactly that, what Donald Trump said. Really, I'm moving more generally to the question about the situation with the U.S. journalism today. To what extent you see that the threat, to what extent you see that also there is a solidarity to fight back, when they're shutting down and trying to marginalize more mainstream and legacy media. Where are you looking at?
Last week was a particularly low moment, actually. I thought that I had lost my capacity to be shocked until I heard the President of the United States say of the killing of an individual, forget that he was a journalist, the killing of an individual who had gone to his home country's consulate for documentation, and that home country had him killed and dismembered. And to hear the President of the United States shrug that off as things happen just kind of completely floored me, because to me, that whole interaction summed up exactly where we are in the United States. A president who doesn't just have disregard for the sanctity of human life, doesn't just have disregard for the importance and the value of journalists, but actually active contempt in many cases for journalism and independent media. But that he could stand up, or sit down rather, he was sitting down, and actually say to somebody's face a completely different version of the reality that everybody else understood. So he was asked by a reporter why he'd invited the Crown Prince Mohammed from Saudi Arabia to join with him, and given that he was implicated in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and Trump said he knew nothing about it. He knew nothing about it, which is a direct contradiction to the findings of his own intelligence service. In 2021, the US intelligence services found, and it corroborated a report that had already been carried out by a UN Special Rapporteur, Agnes Kalamar, that Crown Prince bin Salman would have had orchestrated that murder. And so, to me, that encapsulated the dangerous moment that we're in which there is this huge contempt and disregard for facts and the people who bring them in the United States. And that's manifesting itself in huge amounts of pressure. Pressure on big news organizations who are being threatened by Donald Trump every time he doesn't like anything they report with these huge lawsuits. And that has a trickle-down effect also, where people feel much more emboldened to harass journalists online, where immigration officials and police feel comfortable arresting journalists or threatening journalists who are covering protests. So the environment is much more febrile for journalists in the United States. I am concerned that we haven't seen, in every case, a sort of full-throated defense of an independent media. So things that worry me include, the ABC Newses of this world and the CBSs of this world essentially settling with Trump over spurious lawsuits. Because once you do it once, you set the bar. So the authorities know that they can keep doing that and they can keep putting that pressure on. I hope that with last week, in which, by the way, the president also called a female journalist who asked him a question piggy. She was asking him about, I think, his relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, and he said, "Quiet, piggy." I mean, you couldn't make it up. But I'm hoping that gave people some backbone, that they realized that actually this is not acceptable and we need to stand up and speak out about it really vocally. But I haven't seen that sort of really full-throated defense as much as I had hoped that we would.
Jodie, you traveling, speaking to in a lot of events, have more access to speak to some government representatives. And for the last decade, I think, at least for us, it was since the first Russian invasion, there is all this discussion about fake news, disinformation, digital technologies. It dominates security forums. It's dominate, like when you speak about the politicians, they now speak so much about the importance of the media and the threat of the disinformation. At the same time, the budgets are still shrinking. And I was, for instance, I won't name the country, but I was just recently kind of disappointed because one of the European public broadcasters, one of kind of the countries you won't expect, is shutting down the service which kind of produced slower analytical journalism. I sometimes it just opposite, there are more politicians speaking about the importance of the media because they understand how media becoming kind of danger for them. But everything they do is counterproducing. The budget of the public broadcasters are smaller. The support is less and less. Even you have the issues, with BBC struggling and a lot of other things. So do you really see that this is a kind of a just schizophrenic, for me?
Massive cognitive dissonance here. Massive cognitive. So we know that a major cause of insecurity is mis and disinformation. And yet, the way in which we are seeing countries respond is not by investing more money in supporting independent journalism for the main. I mean, you look at the United States, which essentially killed off Voice of America, killed off Radio Free Europe, killed off Radio Free Asia, trying to decimate NPR and PBS in the US. So instead of increasing investment in the dissemination of fact-based information, governments are moving away from that whilst upping their investments in other kinds of defense. So, we're seeing more money go into military budgets, but not into those kinds of so-called soft efforts that can help shore up security. But simultaneously, and this is what I think is even more worrying and worse, actually, is not only are we seeing less and less investment in the provision of information and credible information, but journalists themselves are being rebranded as security threats themselves. So if you think about how the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, talked about journalists in the Pentagon. This idea that journalists were kind of roaming around the Pentagon, diving into offices and going through people's drawers. There's this really strong, increasingly strong narrative that links back to something we talked about right at the very beginning, right around Israel, about journalists themselves and the act of journalism being a security risk and a security threat. And that's really dangerous to us, because if we are rebranded simply for wanting to find out information and facts and disseminate those facts as security risks, then again, there's the ability to restrict us gets more and more justified. I think it's almost worse than this cognitive dissonance that we're talking about, right? Where people know about lies and misinformation and they know that accurate information is important. They're not just not investing in it, they're also actively doing everything they can to discredit the very people who are providing that information.
I'd ask you to find some argument why the journalist should be protected. In particular, I recently was at the very nice event run by Maria Ressa, a famous Filipino reporter by her organization. And the key note speakers, there was Amal and George Clooney there. And what was interesting for me, I never really thought about that. And in both cases, their parents were journalists. George Clooney's father was quite famous journalist in the US. And in fact, Amal's mother was a political editor. And they were very passionate to explain why journalists matter, because they were born in such families. And I really like how Amal really explained that, the stopping the journalists from information is depriving the community from the information. So it's not an attack on a person, it's an attack on the right of the community to know something. But the situation, these attacks on media are so normalized that I think that we still need to return and actually explain why at the first hand the journalists were ever protected. Because now, when I'm going to the front line, and it's actually now even the Western organizations understand in Ukraine that you don't wear a specific vest because you'll be targeted, because it's kind of normal. But you need to return maybe to younger journalist generation, say, once it was a protection. Actually, the journalists, they could even go and to interview another side. Do you know, it used to be like that. I think that it just becoming so old. So why the journalists were protected? Why this protection should be there? Can you just basically explain to most of us who grew up and are operating in the environment when we don't ever remember that it was a case?
I can give you so many examples about why we need people whose job it is to uncover information and facts that others would want to keep hidden. Mariupol is a good example, right? The lies that Russia was pushing out about Mariupol and, when it bombed the maternity hospital and said they were actors, it required us to have journalists there to report what was actually happening. You think about the number of cases where it is the work of journalists that have helped expose health scandals, for example. So you think about thalidomide, the drug that was given to pregnant mothers. It took a long campaign of research by the Sunday Times in the UK to really expose the fact that the drug thalidomide was causing birth deficiencies. It's taken journalists to expose when water is being polluted, when companies are illegally mining, and when the police are engaged in illegal acts, when courts are corrupt and not delivering justice. We need journalists to get all of that information. It doesn't just magically appear. And so without that, we are all poorer. There are countless studies that show those places that no longer have access to local journalism, there's less community cohesion, there's less oversight of the decisions that are made. Taxes go up. All of that has impact on our lives. I just think we have lost the connection that brings it back to you and me, right? Because we're so used to hearing about mainstream media. And of course, if all you watch is a news outlet that's trying to cover an entire country, you're not necessarily going to see yourself represented. You're not necessarily going to hear the stories that impact you as an individual. And so reminding people that it is the work of journalists to uncover those facts, to bring them to us so that we can be more informed and live as freely and safely as possible, I think is what we need to do to reconnect it back to why that matters to you. And we see it whenever, you saw it in Ukraine when the war happened, people really turned to journalists for information. When the wildfires broke out in California in January, there was a huge surge in radio listenership, right? People keep talking about how we don't need radio anymore because we've got the internet. Well, when the internet goes down, the radio still works. People raced to turn on their radio so that they could understand where the fires were moving and what was happening. All of that is journalists and journalism. So I just think we need to get back to explaining the link between what we report and the impact that that has on our everyday lives.
So do you also follow the deliberate attack on the women journalism? Recently, I've been speaking to a number of the events and it's happened globally, but, the Ukrainian organization, the Women in Media, recently has done the research where really it was quite a sample of the female journalists who 80% of them experience kind of sometimes type of the online violence, and 60% admitted they didn't understand first that was a violence, a kind of all those harassment. And for me, it was interesting that I mentioned, and I was speaking, to the journalists from Philippines, from the other countries, and on the anecdotal level, wherever I meet the female journalists, they would speak about those type of the harassment. Is it something you follow and you really see that there is a kind of trend of, in particularly, like the sexism and misogyny against women journalists? You just recently mentioned the case when the female journalist was named a piggy by the president, like that's exactly the case.
We don't conduct those kinds of surveys that you've talked about, but all of the surveys say the same thing, essentially, which is online harassment is largely targeted at women and those from marginalized communities. And anecdotally, what we see is that appears to be getting worse, not better. So even though we've had years in which we've identified this problem and called this problem out, it's getting worse, in part because many of the platforms have lifted a lot of the restrictions around what people can say and how they're tackled when they do say those things, and in part because of the enabling environment that we talked about. When you're leaders, when you've got the people in the highest positions of power calling women piggy, or you've got someone like Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, he used to call journalists prostitutes. This idea that we saw it in Brazil also with Bolsonaro, who has accused journalists of kind of selling themselves for stories. There's this kind of deep-seated, persistent misogyny that has been set ablaze by the internet and seems to be, sadly, more and more unchecked. We just have to keep calling it out, and we have to keep calling it unacceptable and providing mechanisms to support journalists when they face that, rather than what some of the environments I think a lot of our predecessors grew up in, which was a kind of, you've got to shrug and take it because that's what you have to expect.
Organization like yours, what do you do with the platforms themselves? Because, for instance, what we know that especially like the journalists from the smaller countries, including the governments from the smaller countries or newsroom from the smaller countries, we just don't have capacity to reach out to any of the major platforms just because they don't care. You still in an American-based organization with a name in the US, and most of those platforms are based in the United States. So what is your struggle and fight with the platforms, with the global digital companies on what are your priorities? Because like for us, okay, Ukraine at least is a bit big to get into them, but it's still almost impossible for us. But for the US and for CPJ, maybe.
So we continue to flag the most egregious cases where we see that people are under serious threat, where, for example, we see people's accounts being spoofed, where we think that they're in imminent danger. the level of engagement is much lower now from the companies. We're seeing much less interest in really tackling this problem systemically. We still have that relationship where we are able to raise individual cases, but the kind of real systemic commitment has ebbed significantly. And you've seen that, and partly that's a very deliberate political shift in the US. I think what's interesting is the number of people who are now looking to alternatives, who are looking to alternative platforms, other ways of communicating that potentially allow them to have greater control over both what is seen, but also what is said about what is seen. And I think that's a very interesting development. You mentioned Maria Ressa. She's been working, and her team have been working for many years on a different kind of community-sourced social media. And I think actually those are going to be some of the ways that are going to be the best defense, because the companies are showing less and less willingness to address these issues. But also we've got governments that often address this in a very blunt instrument sort of way, right? So the way that they want to deal with hateful content on social media is often a very blunt set of rules on online harm that can end up nullifying free speech because they fail to have any kind of degree of nuance. So I think some of these alternative platforms are going to be some of the best ways that we can sort of get out of this very dark atmosphere in which journalists, women, anyone who says anything that is not of the mainstream gets harassed and targeted.
You often mentioned, Jodie, that now there is a new way of pressuring the journalists globally using the law. And it's not exactly the law of defamation, but actually the other types of law which shut down not just the newsrooms, but individuals, like whether they are accused of money laundering, not paying taxes, but just, all kind of the things which person in the country which is less free can be under the, extreme pressure of the authorities. So what is this tendency and what's possible to do? You try to provide some legal aid. Where are we heading? In Ukraine, we're also very cautious because we do have a martial law, and Ukrainian society fights back quite actively if there is an attempt of the government to vote for something weird. We usually create a buzz and stop it. But I see sometimes that, they recklessly or without understanding can create a law which at first would look harmless, but then it happened to be a problem if you leave, and you can be like on the hook.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest issues is the misuse of laws. Governments have got quite smart, right? They know that if you accuse them of abusing the rule of law, you have an argument that can easily be sustained. If you work notionally within the confines of the law, it's much harder. So what we've tended to see in recent years is governments going after journalists not for their content, but for other reasons. So tax evasion, money laundering, national security issues, because all of that feels incidental to their journalism. And that has two effects. The first is it kind of throws up sand. It starts to make you think, well, maybe there's something there. I think that so-and-so is a great reporter, but maybe they didn't pay their tax, or maybe they didn't do this. And so you start to doubt them. And of course, that sets up the conditions whereby you're ready to believe that they are a criminal and they can be silenced. It also can pull those journalists and their news organizations into very long, very expensive, very complicated litigation. So they'll be in that litigation for a long time, and therefore it acts as a warning to other journalists not to perhaps engage in them. So this so-called lawfare is actually, on the part of some of these governments, very clever, because it's much cheaper than attacking a journalist physically, much less controversial. It's much less controversial than arresting them for their free speech and their content, because it has the sort of appearance of legality and law. And that's what's difficult to tackle. It also means we have to rethink our resources, because organizations like CPJ have traditionally thought about and traditionally had relationships with media lawyers and experts in defamation and libel. Now suddenly we need to build a whole cadre of lawyers and experts who are experts in tax law and international trade and so on. And so I think people are learning new ways to attack journalists, and so we've got to learn new ways to defend them.
I, in this regard, was fascinated by Gustavo Gorriti, this brilliant Peruvian journalist who found like an interesting way of using the law of defamation in a different way. As long as they prepare a very important investigation, they have their own team of lawyers, which say that they would sue anybody who would call their investigation fake news as a defamation. I'm like, that's actually a very interesting way to have, to use the law differently. I kind of understand it's a bit a different issue, but I do see that the whole point is to be creative and finding your other ways how to fight. And what Gustavo did was pretty amazing. And I said, like, that's quite an interesting case, because if there is a guy, a politician in Peru who will say, oh, the investigation of Gorriti team is fake news, he's ready to say, like, prove it in the court. And which also makes me optimistic. So when I was preparing for our talk, I looked quite at some of the interviews, and it's quite usual to ask about what gives you optimism. And you speak about the, local journalism and the communities. And I should also say that I've been just speaking at 5 big universities in Philippines, and everywhere there was a audience over 100 people, a lot of students from journalist faculties. And what I was fascinated that almost in every university, there were a couple of people who were running local students' publications, and they mattered. And so really it was such a puzzling world of the local media, which I've seen in the smaller towns, press clubs, organization, that you think like, okay, what I knew about Filipinos journalism was the case of Maria Reza, but another colleague who is currently in jail. But, there is quite a vibrant amount of journalists. When I look in Ukraine, and we're running one of the small projects where we're distributing the stipends for hyper-local newsrooms. And these are thousands of local publications in the villages which are frontline. And once I thought, like, they're in a poor situation. Of course, not everybody of them is good. Some of them are not providing, like, the best quality journalism to the national standard because it's a village publication. But you cannot shut them down, because there are thousands of them. So, when I was starting my career as a foreign news reporter, in Ukraine, there were 2 channels who were doing foreign news and 2 who were mainly translating Reuters. And if you don't work for the state media, there is no way for you to work in this profession. So here is my kind of optimism. There is a place to work for you, that you can create your own collective to do that. What are your things which, in the years where the attacks against journalists are deadliest, it's easy to say that your organization can't do much because things are getting bad and worse. What is your argument that things are not that bad in some way?
I'm optimistic because there are still, I would say, the majority of people in this world who care about facts. And there are, in every country, a huge array of people working in local journalism and regional journalism and national journalism and international journalism who are committed to reporting those facts and getting out the information regardless of the threat. And that bravery, that courage to carry on doing the job even when you are faced with the deadliest consequences is what gives me optimism. That I work every day for people who are knowingly taking unbelievable risks because of their commitment to report accurately what they see happening in their world. And the very least I can do is to support them to do that work. And that's what gets me up every day and gets me out of the door and gives me hope.
I do want also to encourage people. I will say, like, when people think that they don't trust somebody, it means like they care about the trust. So when we really speak so much about the danger of the disinformation and all kind of the technology, I said, like, But that means that our profession is even more important.
People wouldn't be targeting journalists and arresting them and killing them in record numbers if the work we didn't matter. You don't harm people that are unimportant. You harm people when they're doing something that matters and is impactful.
But beyond that, there is also the kind of pattern in more democratic societies to kind of marginalize quality or legacy media. And then you say, look, if you speak so much about disinformation and other things, we are actually trained to verify, to facilitate, and to provide some useful data. It's actually the only thing we are professionally trained, and that's exactly what is needed. So yes, I hope, I'm not like hope, I know we will survive and we will do, but thank you so much for the talk and for telling all those things. I really hope that not just journalists are listening to us, but also trying to understand where we are now in this world. And I also want to have a bit more solidarity of the Ukrainians who are in a very hard situation. But I always say, in some countries, they kill the profession. In here, they kill the journalist, but at least our profession is very, very robust at this moment.
I think what Ukrainian journalists have shown repeatedly is how valuable and important the work is, again and again and again. And I can't stress enough my admiration and awe for the work that you are all doing in unimaginably difficult circumstances.